Okay, well, I think we should get started. If everybody on the panel could please unmute their mics, appreciate it. And get their pictures going, there we go. Okay, great. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jill Mayer, and I am the acting Camden County Prosecutor. And we're here today to have a roundtable discussion with the panelists on the findings and recommendations of the Youth Bias Task Force report that was issued recently in October of last year, that was prepared by the New Jersey Interagency Task Force to combat youth bias with the support of Governor Murphy, Lieutenant Governor Oliver, and of course, Attorney General Graywall. As with many events these days, unfortunately, we are not able to do a roundtable in the real sense of the word. And of course, we would all prefer to be physically together, that's for sure. But I think we're all getting used to these Zoom events, and unfortunately, this is the format that we have to use today. So, but thank you everyone for being there. So before we start, I again want to say a big thank you to everyone who has logged on to this event. This topic certainly is incredibly important and could not be more relevant during these really challenging times. And certainly we can all agree that 2020 has been a year like no other year that we could imagine. Now, for those who may be just logging on and didn't have a chance to perhaps review the bias report, the report and its findings and recommendations were a result of information that was gathered by a variety of departments, including the Division of Civil Rights, the Department of Education, the Division of Criminal Justice, Juvenile Justice Commission, etc., along with a lot of community listening sessions that took place and were conducted throughout the state. And much like the use of force listening sessions that we've participated in the past, these listening sessions allowed for people to provide input on their experiences during the listening sessions, but also to submit their written comments about their experiences. And so all of that information really culminated together, was pulled together and analyzed, and the result were these findings and the report that was issued by the task force. So the report itself, while quite long, really was broken down into three separate categories. And those categories were the, if I can click onto here, we'll move forward. Whoop, there we go. Education, law enforcement, and public engagement. And our goal here today is to bring together a very diverse panel to discuss those findings and recommendations, and to really raise people's awareness and to hopefully implement those recommendations in their schools and their communities. Before we get into everything, I would like to introduce our panelists. We have Dr. Ron Johnson, who is the superintendent of the Lawnside School District. Good afternoon, Dr. Johnson.
Good afternoon.
And we have Rosie Arroyo, who is the administrator at the Camden County Youth Services Commission. Good afternoon, Rosie. How are you?
Good. Thank you for having me.
All right. We also have Riley Keenan, who is the director of the Center for Family Services. How you doing, Riley?
Hi, I'm actually not the director of the whole center, but I'm a program director. I'm doing well.
There you go. I gave you a promotion. Sorry about that.
I know. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah. Okay. And our very own Camden County Prosecutor's Office Detective, Kairos Ingalls, who serves in our Major Crimes Unit, which is the unit that handles bias crimes here at the Prosecutor's Office. How you doing, Kairos?
I'm doing good, and you? Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. We're glad to have you here. We also have Assistant Prosecutor Tim Chatton, who is the Section Chief of our Juvenile Unit here at the Prosecutor's Office.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for this opportunity, Prosecutor.
But most importantly, we have Collingswood High School senior, Ayanna Jones. How you doing, Ayanna? How are you?
I'm good. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for being here. Really appreciate it. And we also have Sterling High School junior, Giovanna Thomas. How are you, Giovanna?
Hi, I'm doing good.
Good. So I say most importantly when I referred to Ayanna and Giovanna because, you know, our high school panelists are really of paramount importance to this discussion today. And I really respect their confidence and their courage in being here today, because it takes a lot to talk about these really sensitive topics. It takes a lot for adults to do, but I know it can be really challenging for our youth. So I really want to say thank you again so much for being part of this discussion and for accepting my invitation to be part of this panel. So thank you again so much. So I'll just start. So I am the moderator today, and we did put together a PowerPoint. And as you can see in the PowerPoint that's up on the screen now, as I discussed, we're going to talk about 3 different areas that the report touched on, and the first being education. But before we really get into all that, there was something that in reading the report jumped out at me, and it was this. It was statistics, and that is that children and teens account for 53% of bias incident offenders and 45% of the victims of bias incidents. And to me, that just really struck me because, you know, that tells me that our youth are really sort of at the epicenter of this problem in society, both as victims and offenders. And I think all these areas are just so challenging for adults to wade through and process and manage that, you know, it must be just exceptionally more difficult for our youth to be able to wander through these different challenging times. So that really just jumped out at me, and I thought I'd just share that to sort of start off our conversation. But so, and I want to start with you, Dr. Johnson, if we could. You know, the young people spend a majority of their time in school or on school grounds, either in class or after school at club events or sporting events. And so the school environment really is front and center in this discussion in the report, because that's really the place where so much of what is recommended is to be implemented, right? So in that regard, I want to talk about the 2 most critical recommendations that are put in the report that are on the screen right now, and that is the implementation of mandatory anti-bias curricula in the K through 12 schools, starting at a very young age, as you can see from that recommendation, but also mandatory anti-bias training for all educators and other school employees who interact with students. So in essence, anyone who would interact with students. So as a superintendent of a school, Dr. Johnson, do you think this is a good idea and that it will actually help to bring about the change that the report's looking to do?
Yes, ma'am. So good afternoon again to everyone. To Prosecutor Mayor, I want to thank you for this opportunity to serve on the panel and discuss a very important issue which surrounds bias in schools. And looking at the 2 recommendations that were discussed in the report, I have to say I'm somewhat conflicted, and I'm saying conflicted from the standpoint of I have a certain level of optimism, but then there's also a level of skepticism. So I think all of the recommendations will be impactful as long as people and institutions are honest about their levels of bias. If they're willing to engage in courageous conversations and, more importantly, willing to do the work. So my optimism comes from, especially knowing I can't speak for the whole state, I can speak for Camden County. Myself, along with many of our colleagues under the leadership of our Executive County Superintendent, Dr. Lavelle Pugh Bassett, have been addressing issues of bias and equity for approximately the last 5 years. And then that work that we've done at the superintendent's level has filtered down to curriculum directors, special education directors, even down to our business administrators, making sure that the adequate resources to deal with certain program needs are met. You know, there's also, and you spoke to 2 young ladies. I'm glad I go before them because I don't want to speak after them because I know they're very powerful young ladies. But we also have, as you'll hear, young folks that are part of the conversation. And in fact, they come to our roundtable meetings monthly, and they give us and share their experiences with us as superintendents. It's good for us to hear from the children and understand kind of what they're experiencing in the classrooms. In addition to kind of what we do as a county level, individual school districts participate in different equity consortiums, whether that's through the University of Pennsylvania or other organizations. Here in Lawnside, We participate in the Network for Educational Excellence Through Equity out of EIRC down at Rowan, where we attend monthly sessions and we talk about bias and equity and things of that nature. But again, so that's the optimistic side of it. The skeptical side of it is that there are still many school districts that may feel that they don't have a problem with bias. And when you feel you don't have a issue with bias, I think that that leads to equity issues within the schools or the school districts. So whether that's students of color receiving harsher disciplinary actions or being disproportionately referred to special education programs or being denied access to higher curriculum opportunities, such as advanced placement classes or honors classes. As a kind of personal, even though I'm a superintendent, I'm the father of an 18-year-old Black male who's attended public schools all his life. And I distinctly remember that when he was in kindergarten, we went to back to school night and the teacher asked, first question out of her mouth was, when is Jaden's birthday? So for me as an educator, when in kindergarten, the teacher asked that question, it says to me, well, she's considering at the end of the year, either retaining him, having him repeat kindergarten, or possibly referring him to the special services department. So obviously I had to advocate for my son and have some critical conversations with the principal. He continued through public school, got to the testing grades. And when he would take his state assessments, he always scored in the advanced proficient range, always received straight A's. But when it came time to be recommended for gifted and talented classes, there was one little obstacle, which was the teacher recommendation. And so while he may have had the grades and he may have the test scores, the teachers needed to recommend him for the program. And if you have bias in the teachers, then it can deny some students access to those opportunities. Once again, I had to advocate for my son. I'm happy to say that fortunately my son has graduated from high school, received straight A's all the way through. He's a freshman at Howard University majoring in mechanical engineering, received straight A's his first marking period. So the optimistic side of the story is my son achieved, and fortunately I was there to advocate for him. The skeptical side is not every student has a Dr. Johnson sitting in their home to advocate for them. And so the question is, in the absence of a parent or someone that may be willing or able to do the advocacy work, are there people in the schools that's going to advocate for these types of children?
Point, even within a school, there are biases. I saw in the report there was a mention of just inconsistency. Do you find, as a superintendent, I'm sure you're aware of different curricula that's at different school or different programs that are at different schools. Do you find that there's inconsistency between schools throughout the county and possibly throughout the state as to certain schools implementing, I guess, more broad range curricula that encompasses, I guess, more diverse histories, things of that nature?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah.
So I find that, yeah, there's some districts that lack in their level of diversity in the curriculum. I think some educators feel a level of discomfort with teaching certain content, particularly content that they may themselves be unfamiliar with. You know, I think I would call it what we call the proverbial peeling of the onion, so to speak. As you tend to pull back layers, you sometimes will expose things. So there may be some situations that conflict with like a historical perspective that is universally known. So the easiest example would be the story of Christopher Columbus, right? So how many years have people been taught that Christopher Columbus discovered America? Now many school districts have transitioned over to celebrating that day as Indigenous People Day. So I think sometimes there's a reluctancy of some educators to dive into certain areas because sometimes it may bring back a reality that causes people to address inconsistencies in a way, particularly historically, things and stories were told to them.
I wanted to just turn to, you bring up a point, Giovanna and Ayana, if I could for a second. I don't know if you've had the opportunity to talk to each other about the curriculums in each of your schools. Have you had an opportunity to do that? No, I'd just be curious as to how one school compares to another, or if they're different, you know, which would go to the point of there seems to be inconsistency of implementation of curricula throughout the county or the state even.
Mm-hmm.
No, we haven't had time to talk to each other about what goes on in the schools. But just coming from Lindenwold into Sterling, I know that the curriculums are completely different, and what we get taught in Lindenwold versus Sterling are two different worlds completely.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So I wanted to go to our next slide and the concept of what this sort of talks about. And that is one of the findings in the report was that children learn bias and racism from a variety of different sources or experience, you know, that of course that it's not something that they're born with. And I think this quote certainly articulates that idea very well from Nelson Mandela, which is, no one is born hating another person because of the color of his skin or his background or his religion. People must learn to hate. And if they can learn to hate, they can be taught to love, for love comes more naturally to the human heart than its opposite. So it sort of brings us to sort of that concept of, you know, nature versus nurture, so to speak, and that idea. And of course, it goes back to, again, children are in school a lot. And so the school really has a tremendous influence on how they think and what they believe and what stereotypes exist or don't exist, et cetera. So, Ayan, if I could ask you a question about that. Do you feel like your school adequately has a diverse curriculum? And do they attempt to teach about bias and unconscious bias? And if so, do you think they do it well enough?
I don't think that it's really a diverse in the curriculum. I used to go to Pennsauken, and that's definitely different from the curriculum to Collingswood. I don't think there's much diversity in the curriculum at all. I think there's much to be improved by it, but I really don't see a diversity in that.
If you take a look at this slide, as I was saying, nature versus nurture, so much I think is learned just from in unspoken ways, I guess, you know, in terms of who is teaching the course, who's not teaching the course, whose misbehavior, as I said, is excused or not, or as you mentioned, Dr. Johnson, about your son, you know, whose academic achievements are being supported or denied, you know, and it's such a very complicated area, and something that I guess, you know, the task force is truly trying to change to implement consistency throughout the counties and throughout the states. So I wanted to ask you, Giovanna, did you have any particular examples of some incidents that may have occurred at school that either you were subject of or observed that you would want to share with us?
Would that be with academics or just events that happened that I thought shouldn't have been excused like it was?
And either of those are fine.
Okay, there were a couple events over the summer when there were conflicting views throughout our school, and people were calling people the N-word with the ER. They were calling people monkeys, and how the school handled it versus the people that were trying to stand up for the people that they were talking to. The people who were defending the person that were getting it said to them got in more trouble than the person who actually said it completely. And I thought that was a little ridiculous because how they were saying stuff and what they were saying, I felt like should have been more handled, just for the simple fact of these students are back in school with protection because the administration is scared that something's going to happen to them. But how come they didn't get in more trouble, like out of school suspension, expelled for some of the stuff they said was very, very wrong. And how I look at it, if I were to say it to them, I would get in a lot more trouble than they would if they're saying it to me. There were numerous events over the summer, and not one of the people I felt like got in enough trouble as they should have.
And then as a student, what do you think your role could be in trying to bring about change in that regard? Do you think that student organizations could sort of band together and be able to go and present ideas to the administration or present their concerns?
Most definitely. I'm not going to say I have a bad administration. I actually have a really good one. It's more of just, I think they don't know how to handle these scenarios, and I think they're very much afraid of one side of the party maybe doing something to the school to offend it, instead of actually listening and taking in what they're saying, more than them pushing the what is the word I'm looking for? Them pushing a solution and not really caring about what they say, but it needs to be done. So if a couple groups get together and present to the administration maybe some ideas on how to do it to the point where they don't have to worry about being sued or something, I think it will benefit us a lot.
Right. There are so many different forms of bias and racism that exist, I think. And, you know, if we could talk a little bit about what your experiences are, Giovanna and Ayana, with respect to not just potentially racism at school, but what about gender bias? Do you feel like that comes into play in your school? So do you have an experience that you might want to talk about in that regard?
Yeah, I think that especially with clothing, if another person kind of like, I don't know, every shape is different. And I feel like with at least my school district, certain clothing that you wear, obviously some things are obviously not allowed to be worn in school, but I would wear, or others would wear, the same thing, like literally the same outfit, and they would get a harsher punishment, or I would get a harsher punishment or sent home because of what I wore, even though we wore the same thing. So I guess in gender bias regards, that's kind of like where I feel like is really big at our school, that a girl and a girl can wear the same exact thing and one person can be sent home. Like wearing a shirt that is longer, but you're, I don't know, skinnier and taller, and it may go up to your belly button, but someone else wears the same thing. And it's just a harsher punishment, at least at my district.
Do you think, and this is a discussion, I guess, do you think school uniforms are a way to combat that issue? Or would you not want to give up that, you know, that sort of ability to express yourself in your clothing?
Just from coming from Lindenwold, a town that doesn't have a lot, it has a lot of poverty. When we had uniforms, I felt like it was really bad because it made students focus on the shoes. And the shoes are a lot more money. And for the simple fact of there were people wearing $400 shoes, and then there were people wearing $4 Walmart shoes, and how they were treated versus people who had the Jordans on were really bad. So I think uniforms, in my opinion, are not a good option. Maybe as if, like, say a school does say you can wear a uniform if you would like. But in my school, I'm going to build off what Ayana said. I am a bigger girl. I am a little heavier and I do have more curves. And the one day I had on jeans and a shirt. And another girl came in with ripped jeans, a tank top, and they made me change. And I was just kind of confused because ripped jeans are against your policy at all. But because when I put my arms up, my belly button shows, it was like, you have to change. But she had a tank top on, she had a spaghetti strap on with a jacket, but the jacket was off her shoulders and jeans. And it kind of made me upset because it's like, I can't control my weight or my body. And I'm getting penalized for something that I feel like everybody in the school. And it's the same thing with gender. A female will wear ripped jeans and girl gets sent home and may change. But with a male will wear ripped jeans, and it's like everybody just looks the other way. And it's kind of upsetting. It's really upsetting to me because it made a lot of girls look at their body differently when they would get a comment from a teacher. I being one of them.
How about you, Ayana?
Yeah, I've had comments on what I was saying, but to add on to the uniform question that you asked, I think that I think that uniforms can go either way, having it or not having it. Having it it'll stop it completely from teachers saying you can't wear this and everyone's wearing the same thing. The only thing that you would have to get is shoes. But also not having uniforms is just like that bias where it's like just looking at the two girls wearing the same exact thing. I don't think that how do I say it? I don't think that's something that should be a big discussion on or worry about. I don't know. It's like that shouldn't really matter if two girls are wearing the same thing. It's just two girls wearing the same thing. Their weight shouldn't matter in that case.
If I may add, last year, the Youth Services Commission hosted, in partnership with the Camden County Library System, a discussion on the book, The Pushout. And it's the book basically discusses just the over supervision, over quote unquote policing of Black young girls in schools, and how that can eventually or can lead to the school to prison pipeline, getting involved in other activities, or even pushing someone there when they were not there in the first place. Some of that bias that Giovanna and Ayana mentioned are critical points in that book discussion or in the film, because some of these young ladies that experienced these things, there were things that put upon them based on the bias of teachers or people around them, right? So they have to carry that weight of things that they had nothing to do with prior to walking into that classroom, right? So you have what people may have used on certain other people, whether it's their physical appearance or if they come in and have a bad day and they may or may not get talk back to somebody or anything. Those are all like instances that can lead to other things without slowing things down and really finding out what the root causes was, which is what the report shows. Like, what are the things that are causing these disruptions in the community, these conversations to not go forward and not to happen, so that we can actually represent our students and stand by them, so they feel stronger and protected in these environments that are meant for them to be safe. It's not that people go into these systems as careers to do these things. It's they're taught in those universities a certain way. They're taught as they're being trained as a police officer, as a teacher, as a principal, like these almost I don't know what the word, like the right word, but in these not 21st century peer pressures that our students are dealing with. I think our county has started to address a lot of that. Dr. Johnson mentioned a little bit earlier about the strong conversation around equity, but in reality, like, do people in the community, our administrations might be talking equity, but does the rest of the community understand what our students are looking for in terms of equity, and even beyond that, what is just and what is right?
I'm kind of jumping a little bit out of order here, but I just wanted to turn to Tim for 1 second and just talk about what kind of training you talk about, different administrations and different, not just the schools, I should say, that implicit bias training takes place in not only just the schools, but also here at the prosecutor's office, and how that affects this particular institution, which people frequently look to as to how does bias play a role in the justice system. So Tim, if you could just talk about that for a second.
Yes, I believe that bias absolutely plays a role in every aspect of life. If you have a bias, then it's going to impact pretty much everything you do. I don't think you can draw a line between your home, your work, your relationships and say, well, that bias is only going to affect this. I think it crosses over into all those different aspects. And that includes the criminal justice system. However, that bias can be overcome through education and training. As we've heard, it's learned behavior. So we need to, in essence, not a real word, unlearn it. We need to teach the opposite. And I think we do a really good job at that, both with our youth, but also with our staff here at the prosecutor's office. Our office takes bias and implicit bias very seriously. The Attorney General's office has developed an incredible program that we utilize. We undergo yearly mandatory bias training. And I took the course a few years ago, and it's where I really started to learn about implicit bias. And it's eye-opening. One of the examples they use in that training is they put up on a large screen pictures of individuals. And they ask you, in your heart, which person do you fear the most? Which person, when you're walking down the street at night, do you cross the street to the opposite side when you see them coming? You know, the man in the suit with the glasses on, or the young man with the hood up? And, you know, as a father of 3 teenage boys who wear hoodies and they go out in public, obviously, you can understand that sometimes people's perceptions are false. Many times they're false based on implicit biases. And when you look at that, it's troubling. Again, our APs and our detectives go through this mandatory training every year. And we do this not only because it's mandatory, because we want to raise awareness and we want to guard against any form of implicit bias impacting or infiltrating the decisions that we make on a daily basis here at the prosecutor's office. Not only do we have to make sure that we don't allow this to impact what we do, but we have to make sure that the bias of others does not come into the criminal justice system, and in particular the juvenile justice system. Because as we've heard, the bias can be at all layers. It could be at the point of contact. Are certain groups being over-policed? Are certain groups being overcharged? Are certain kids being treated differently in school? And does that result in that kid being charged when they wouldn't have been if they were a different race? Right. So we have to police all those issues to make sure that everyone is treated fairly, equitably, and justly.
Remember, actually, of course, I took the training myself, and I remember sitting in the class, and I don't know if you remember this particular example, but there was a gentleman who was sitting at a desk, sort of in a Zoom call, and his office door opened, and in came this little baby in one of those walkers into the, and then you saw this woman quick run in. She was an Asian woman, and grab the kid out and pull back. And the question to the audience was, who do you think that woman was? And there were a decent number of people who said they thought it was the nanny, when in fact it was this gentleman's wife, as if there was this unconscious bias that the woman, because she was Asian, was the nanny and wouldn't be the wife of the Caucasian man who was sitting at the desk. And you could just hear the oohs and ahs in the rooms, like, you know, and these were, it was one of the examples. I don't know if you recall that particular example during the training, but
yes, that's particularly upsetting, disheartening to me. Being married to an Asian woman and hearing that stereotype, and having 3 sons that are obviously of mixed race, right, and half Asian, that breaks my heart, and that's something that we have to fight against every day.
Right, right. Dr. Johnson, if I could, I want to turn back to you. Riley, I'm not forgetting about you. You're coming up. You're coming up. And Kairos, you're coming up. Dr. Johnson, if I could go back to you for just a minute.
Sure.
In addition to what we talked about curriculum, in addition to what is being taught, who is teaching our children is another question that we should be asking, because it too can be subtly reinforcing stereotypes, right? And I know from looking at your bio, and everybody, I would suggest everybody go and read. I didn't want to take up too much time by reading everyone's background, but in looking at your bio, I saw that you served as an advisor and a mentor for Rowan University's Project Impact, which stands for Increasing Male Practitioners and Classroom Teachers, which is a recruitment and retention program for males of color in teaching. Because the report noted, and this jumped out at me too, that the majority of public school teachers, I want to say the statistic might have been, are 85% white male, or white at the very least. So could you talk about that a little bit in terms of how important it is to not only have a diversified curriculum, but also a diversified teaching staff, and importantly, male teaching staff?
So yeah, I think we discussed the importance of having students see themselves in the curriculum, and the curriculum be reflective of kind of their experiences. It's also equally important that they see staff members that look like them and have similar backgrounds. The project Impact was an initiative started by then Dean of Education, Monica Shealy, to try to increase the amount of males of color that are working in education, public education. Because, you know, first of all, let me say this, good teaching is good teaching. It doesn't matter whether it's a female teacher, male teacher, black teacher, white teacher, Hispanic. If you're a good teacher, you're a good teacher. But there's also, when we talk about biases, there's some things that if someone has a similar background to you, can assist you. So I'll give another example, personal story. I attended a parochial high school here in Camden County, and my guidance counselor told me I shouldn't consider going to a four-year university and maybe should look at other alternatives. And then again, that story is not unique to me because they told a lot of students of color at this particular school that that's their destiny. Fortunately, there was a university in Baltimore, Maryland by the name of Morgan State University, which is a historically Black college and university that accepted me, and I attended. And I went from guidance counselor telling me I shouldn't go to a four-year university to a college professor saying to me, what are you going to do when they start calling you Dr. Ron Johnson? So this professor saw things in me that I didn't never see in myself, and he planted the seeds that enabled me to consider going back to school and receiving a doctoral degree. So sometimes people that have similar backgrounds to the students that they serve understand the challenges that the student may face, but also can help that student navigate some of those challenges to achieve a certain level of success. Whereas another person, because of certain perceptions they may have of the student, will limit that student's potential. So I think that's where the importance of, again, whether it's color or not, male or female, we need to have educators that believe in children. And if you really don't believe in children, you have no business being in education, in my humble opinion.
May I add on to that? I can't hear her. I'm sorry, I can't hear you again. Okay. I've seen that a lot in the Lindenwold High School. I've heard stories. Just because I came out of that district, I know how the guidance counselors were, even in the middle school. They have a lot of doubt on us. They don't really encourage us, and they tell us that we're not really going to go anywhere. That they're just trying to kind of get us through the school so we can at least graduate. But they're saying that a lot of us weren't even going to make it to 11th, 12th grade or even to college. And that's a very big part why I left Lindenwold, just to try and get out of that atmosphere. But coming back earlier to what I said, coming from Lindenwold to Sterling was a very hard thing. From how low the academics were at Lindenwold to how high they were at Sterling, to the culture in Lindenwold to the culture in Sterling. It's a very, I never would have thought that it would have been a big difference between two school districts that are right across from each other. But it really is a lot of stuff going on in these schools that a lot of people are just like this with it. It's sad because there's a lot of youth that are coming up, and we want better for our future. We don't want that to keep happening, definitely.
I think a lot of us have those stories where, in my instance, first generation high school graduate, college graduate, graduate school graduate, my first generation born in this country. But anyone first generation in general, our undocumented populations, or even just those that were born here and are navigating through the concept, what Dr. Johnson shared and what Giovanna also shared. It's not that I don't think I don't honestly, like in my heart, I hope that when our guidance counselors sit down with somebody, they're seeing the easiest route to success for that student, right? But sometimes we are taught as Latinos, as in our Black and Brown communities, and again, I'm sharing what I've experienced, that we fight, we don't give up, we keep going, we're told no, we're going to keep going, and to have those barriers removed would be so much more, it would make things so much more easier for us to navigate. And I had a guidance counselor in my senior year of high school pulled me in April of my graduating year. Now at that time, I didn't apply to any schools. I had no idea what I was doing. I thought I was just graduating. In my family, we didn't talk about things like that. It was just hard work and keep it moving. She asked me what I was going to do with my life. I said, I have no clue. She opened this huge book of like 600 pages and picked 2 schools in the country that were still accepting applications that were that would accept a GPA of mine and to submit. And so I went my first year to an all-girl Catholic university, which later culturally did not fit with who I was. I transferred over to Rutgers Camden, which fit perfectly well because I felt better being in my community. But my sister in middle school was sat down and said, you're going to go to this school versus the high school. And my mom had to fight for her to go to the high school. So because she wanted all of us in the same school. And I look nothing like my sister and my brother in the sense that I'm the white Latina in the family. Everybody else looks Mexican. So I just wanted, those things happen. And whether they're intentional or not, they get in the way of success in our students. In hiring and recruiting teachers, and diverse teachers, it's not just about them being there to reflect what the student population looks like. It's about us being able to provide those teachers with the best professional development geared towards Black and Latino, Asian, Muslim teachers, right? What are we going to do specifically for you to stay culturally relevant for you as a teacher in your community that other students are going to look up to and say, I can do that, I can be that. Those are the things that, while these recommendations are great, please attach funding to those things because our teachers deserve more dollars so that they continue to want to stay in this field, so that we have more Dr. Johnsons, we have more teachers that are going to be there standing up for the students that maybe at some point will then be just like them growing up and becoming other teachers and school administrators. That's what we need, right? Like, these recommendations all throughout are they make sense, right? In hoping that people follow through and actually change. It's about, my colleague always says it's about changing hearts and minds. And that's the hardest thing to do. I'm all about just change. We're gonna make it happen. People just have to come along, right? I'm A to Z in 2 seconds. But I know these things take time. But if we've learned anything from 2020 and the Black Lives Matter movement and our students organizing these amazing discussions with community, their schools and law enforcement, how beautiful is it to be part of that and be supporting of that community. But if we don't have teachers that are just as uplifted to get them to want to stay as teachers, we won't get anywhere.
Yeah, I want to pull you into the conversation. I feel like you're hanging out there a little bit. I want to get you involved here. So did you feel in your educational experience that your teachers reflected enough diversity? Either from a cultural standpoint, a religious standpoint, diversity in race, etc.
Who was that question for?
And that was Riley.
Oh.
Thank
Someone
you.
mentioned that my voice,
couldn't
my
hear the
mic
first
doesn't
part.
sound good. Am I good? Can you hear me?
Yeah, now you're good. So
Okay,
thank you,
all right.
first of all, for the opportunity to be part of this amazing panel discussion. I've been holding my tongue because I've wanted to share on many points from everybody that has spoken. So I have been part of the LGBT community for over 38 years. I'm fairly open with who I am as an individual, both privately and publicly. So I am a trans man. I transitioned 10 years ago at the 11 now, at the age of 40. I'm now 53. So there were a couple things that I wanted to point out, especially in the report. So now the division, DCF is mandated to do training regarding LGBTQ population, gender, non-binary, transgender issues, but it's not really specific. So that being said, when I started my transition, I actually went out and started doing presentations. and just discussing some of the barriers for the community as a whole, but specifically for transgendered individuals. So I'm going to just speak on a couple of points very quickly. I agree with what Dr. Johnson said, what Rosie said. We need to have more LGBTQ educators that are present in the classrooms where they can be supported openly in order to start teaching the curriculum that at this point only 12 schools in New Jersey have started to implement in regards to LGBTQ curriculum. As far as what Dr. Johnson said about, the school systems having to actually acknowledge that they have a bias, I was actually approached last year by a member of a South Jersey school district to do a training for K through 12 for the entire school district. And because of COVID, unfortunately, that didn't happen. But I just want to throw out some statistics because I think that one of the things that the report lacked was how disparities have impacted the LGBTQ youth community regarding homelessness, lack of appropriate healthcare, lack of community and religious supports. A report that was done by True Colors United and the National LGBTQ Task Force stated that nationally, 40% of homeless youth are LGBTQ. In New Jersey, 53% of the homeless youth are LGBTQ. Nationally, for healthcare, 8% of LGBTQ, lesbian, gay, bisexual, and questioning, and 22% of trans individuals avoid medical care that's needed. As far as violence goes, by family members, 43% experience physical violence and 59% experienced psychological violence at home by members of their own family. And in regards to the juvenile justice system, 93% of LGBTQ homeless youth, 46% stated that they were in some form of facility, detention center, jail, so forth. So I know that the report really focuses on racial bias, but I'm here to discuss, the other population that is not only for me personally, but also professionally. The LGBTQ community needs to be represented. We need to be supported. We need to understand and recognize and have people understand the biases that that we face in general. And as somebody mentioned before, the things that we deal with don't just stop at home. They don't stop at the grocery store. They don't stop in the dressing room. They don't stop in the bathroom. As a trans person, when I first transitioned, I was afraid to be stopped by the police because my license still had F on it and it didn't have M, and I had facial hair. So I understand the fear of being, stopped by the police and maybe facing, being put in jail for something that I didn't do. Not being able to go into a restroom, not being able to be recognized and having to always legitimize my existence. So I'm not trying to be on a soapbox here, but I just wanted to say that, LGBT community does face a lot of the same situations as other marginalized populations.
Comments in that regard actually lead perfectly into what I wanted to talk about next, and I'll pull up that slide, get it here. And that is, I guess, the recent bill in January, well, not so recent, January 31st, 2019, Governor Murphy signed a bill into law requiring local school boards to include instruction on political, economic, and social contributions of LGBTQ+ people and individuals with disabilities, and those materials as well to go along with that curriculum. And, one of the things that the report, I guess, noted is that there has been significant resistance, more so than I would say implementing curricula that reflects, say, African-American history or teaching the Holocaust, that there's been more resistance with respect to teaching the contributions of LGBTQ community. So I'd like to sort of talk about that, if you could, for a minute, Dr. Johnson. because you're in the role of then implementing curriculum, and that there's been significant resistance from parents or educators, and how do you deal with that?
So I'm glad you brought up the two kind of mandated curriculums that we as school districts have prior to this legislation been required to implement, which is the Amistad Commission, the Amistad curriculum, as well as the Holocaust curriculum. And again, I think, even with those two, there was some level of resistance. But I think that what we have to do as educators is educate the community and speak to the relevance of the contributions of, let's say, African Americans through the Amistad Commission, or contributions of folks during the Holocaust. And again, both of those offer educators a wealth of resources to address the curriculum needs in their districts. Now, as far as it goes with the newly enacted LGBTQ plus curriculum, again, I my personal opinion, and I don't want to interject my personal opinion, but I'm not sure where a person's sexual orientation diminishes or has anything to do with their contributions or accomplishments, right? So because someone may have an alternative lifestyle doesn't mean that they're not a productive member or contributor to our society. And so for me, it's about humanity, right? So the same way I would want someone to accept me for being an African-American male and kind of validate my experiences and not just kind of diminish my legitimacy, is as an African-American, I have to extend that same courtesy to other marginalized communities. And so for me as an African-American superintendent, I have to also explain to my constituents the relevancy of LGBTQ plus member of our society, because in some ways their experiences almost mirror ours as far as the way biases and the isms, or whatever you want to call it, impact their lives. And so, people are going to express their displeasure, but there was a time where folks didn't want Black people to sit in schools next to white students, and we had to overcome that. So at this point, we have to be allies like people had to be allies for us.
And do you specifically get resistance in your school district from parents? Particular implementation?
What I will say is this: I think I tell people the beauty of education is there really aren't any right or wrong answers, and people are entitled to their opinions and their philosophy. So I know you mentioned earlier about uniforms, so we can argue the relevancy of wearing uniforms or not wearing uniforms. Again, as the leader of the community here in Lawnside, if we receive any resistance, my responsibility is to sit down with an individual parent or groups of parents and discuss and hear their concerns and address them, but also ensure to them that their children have to be exposed to, again, various life experiences. And because someone may have an alternative lifestyle doesn't make them a bad person, right? Or doesn't make them any less of a person. And so again, but that comes from communication, that comes from having a relationship. And I think I have a strong enough relationship here in Lawnside that I could have those conversations with my community. Again, I would hope that other superintendents and educational leaders have those relationships with their community, because again, beyond trying to get parents to buy into an LGBTQ plus curriculum, if you don't have a relationship with your community, there's bigger issues, right, that you have. So I think, but again, I know that the colleagues that I serve with in Camden County, and I can't speak, as I said, for any other county, we're committed to doing this work at whatever level it is needed.
So can I just interject a couple of things on that point in regards to the curriculum in schools?
Yeah.
So there's a group called GLSEN. It's GLSEN. I'll put it in the chat. They have educators resources. They have an educators network. You can register your GSA, which means Gay Straight Alliance. And if you register your GSA, you can get free resources and school resources. They also have something that is excellent called Supporting LGBTQ plus Students of Color, because as somebody mentioned in the chat, students of color that are LGBT experience much more disparities than white people do, basically. and everything in regards to schools and employment and things like that and violence. So I will put that in the chat. But what Dr. Johnson was saying is, I know for a fact that there is resistance in schools because people have reached out to me because of my past presentations. And like I said, I am going to be doing that whole school district from K through 12, and I'm going to be doing a training. But even though, they saw that the curriculum was coming, and like Dr. Johnson said, there are a lot of teachers that feel uncomfortable because they don't understand or don't feel knowledgeable enough to be able to teach that curriculum. But one thing is that the LGBT community has been around since the beginning of time. And the fact that we need to understand that we haven't been documented in history books. We haven't been documented in any form of history unless you dig deep for it. You have to dig deep, just like people weren't aware of redlining and things like that. So I'm ecstatic that this is now, required. And I'm hoping that more than 12 schools in the state of New Jersey will start to take on, this curriculum. And like Dr. Johnson said, everybody needs to be represented equally.
I'm looking at my clock here and I'm like, I can't believe it's already 4:30 and we can only go to 5. There's so much, I feel like there's just so much that we can talk about. So I want to try and, poor Karis has been sitting there for the last hour and a half. But feel free to jump in on any topic, Karis, because, you're an African-American man, in addition to just being a detective in our office, and I'm certain that your perspectives on all this are important to hear. But so I want to try and turn to, there we go. Yep, next slide, there we go. The enforcement of laws topic, right? So this is the second area that I talked about in the beginning, the second of 3 areas that I wanted to talk about, and that is, it's what comes into play, with our office when someone's biases and hatred is not just believed or thought, but is then, acted upon. So I want to turn to you, Detective Ingalls, and say, there's a lot of misunderstanding about what biased crime is, and that there's a difference between biased crimes and a biased incident. So could you, before we get into explaining that difference, could you just explain your role in the Camden County Prosecutor's Office as the biased crimes liaison?
Yes. So when I was listening to everything, I was just being a sponge, trying to soak everything in. Yes, but my role as a bias liaison detective for Camden County is to help investigate potential bias crimes and bias incidents, along with the local police departments that is reporting the cases to our office. Also, I help assist the assistant prosecutor with determining whether an incident is deemed a biased crime or a biased incident. And then in addition, I can also provide any guidance and or trainings relating to biased crimes to any of the local police departments in Camden County. And also I manage and collect any of the statistics and data for all reported biased crimes and incidents in Camden County. So that's basically what I do as a bias liaison detective for our office.
Great. So now, and getting to the slide that everyone can see, could you explain the terminology? Could you explain in essence the difference between a bias incident and a bias crime?
Yes. So as you see on the slide, you'll see the 2 different definitions of a bias incident and of a bias crime. But I'll try and break it down in a more practical way, especially for the youth, can be able to identify in their everyday setting. So first, a bias crime, we can describe that as if you have a person or a group of people who is targeting or is trying to intimidate another person or group solely based on one of the 9 protected classes in the state of New Jersey. And some of those protected classes, as we all know, is sexual orientation, age, race, religion, etc. So I'll try and give one example of that, and I'll tailor it towards the youth population. So let's say if you're in class and the teacher says, hey, we have a new student in school and they're African American. And you have another student who then decides to start a group chat. In that group chat, you have several other students that is of a different race. And in that group chat, you have this one student is sending racially charged messages, images, photographs, saying harassing things in nature. And then that student takes it a step further and they go on social media and he sends the student those same messages, those same harassing style like images and videos and things of that nature. we would classify that as a biased crime because that person or that group of people is solely targeting this person based on their race, right? And so to kind of break down a bias incident, as a bias incident can refer to conduct such as speech, images, or expressions that can demonstrate one's bias, towards a person or a group. And that's where it gets a kind of little gray area, for some people, and to kind of tailor that to the youth South population is this. If a student goes into a bathroom and they go inside a stall and they see a racial slur written on the wall, or they see a symbol like a swastika on the wall, that'll be classified as a bias incident versus a crime. But the main thing is that we want our youth to know is if you are a victim, if you're a witness, a bystander, and you feel something biased or you feel something hatred has occurred, to definitely report it. I heard from the students on here that sometimes they feel their voice isn't heard, but the great thing of having this conversation today is that you also now know who I am, and I am the bias detective for the county. So, and on the slide, it'll have my number. If you ever feel as though you are a victim or witness to something biased in your school or grocery store or wherever, feel free to always call and report it, and know that your voice is heard. And we are here to make sure that don't happen in the future, if that can kind of explain that.
Great, that's very great. I think there's a lot of confusion in that. So in the cases that you've investigated that have ultimately resulted in bias crimes being charged, what obstacles do you see to let people know about in being able to make the case for the prosecution of a bias crime? In terms of, is there an issue with people cooperating? Are people nervous and then delete? Because the phone, right? The phone is like the bane of our existence, but yet the thing that connects us all. But it is often the vehicle that's used to perpetuate these crimes. So could you tell us a little bit about what obstacles you're seeing in those investigations and how that could be changed to be able to better create to create a more a stronger case, I guess, for prosecution?
Yeah, so first we see two main issues, right? And especially with the youth, one is that they may not necessarily know what happened to them is a biased crime or a biased incident. They may know what happened, they don't like it, they don't like how it made them feel, that encounter, but they may not know, okay, this rises to the level of a biased crime or incident. And with that is they tend not to preserve any type of evidence in terms of social media posts, messages, video, photographs, and etc. So we find that sometimes when it comes to youth that they may report what happened to them months later or days later, because at the time they may not have known that, hey, this was a biased crime. But anytime it is reported, we have tools and we have policy and procedures in place that we can try and make a case around that. So whether that be us getting cooperation from the victim to retrieve their password to their social media, we can try and like retrieve things that were once deleted, or also if we speak to students and other witnesses who can kind of corroborate the story of what happened to the victim. So basically our main issue is that a lot of times the student may not know that a biased crime has happened to them.
So going back to our high school students a little bit, because again, how do you talk about all this without getting into social media and the role that it plays in the bias crime, bias incident universe? Giovanna, I'm sorry. Do you think in your experience, and we can start with Ayana, if you're good with that, that online activity and social media helps to promote tolerance, or do you think it primarily is a vehicle that's used to negatively impact individuals of the LGBTQ or African American, Latino, Black and Brown individuals? Do you think it's a positive or a negative?
I think that social media could be either or, positive or negative. And at least in my experiences recently, it's been more of a positive, just from coming out of 2020 and like just starting a new year. But I'd say like from last year that social media was very like definitely negative. There's been a few things. I'll use one of the experiences at my school is that over last year, there were 2 incidents where a kid took a picture of one of the only Black teachers at our school and said something about George Floyd and resemblance of that. And using that comparison shows them that negative side of social media, which kind of hurt the Black community and also hurt the teacher itself. And I think with that, that's the negative parts of it. But the positive aspect of all of that was that students kind of came up and, you know, reported it and also talked about it. I know that I'm one of the leaders for our social justice club, and we took a really big approach to this by creating a Words Have Weight assembly, which was basically saying how slurs affect marginalized groups and saying how it affects even the teachers in the school and the students. And it was a really big and impactful movement kind of thing that we did at our school that was student led. And it turned out to be a better and bigger positive impact. And we're planning on doing it this year as well. But with that, I feel like, you know, I just feel like there are positives and negatives for social media. Sorry, I'm going on a tangent.
No, that's good. That's good. I'm going to actually flip to the next slide because I think it sort of talks about all those issues. You know, it's so easy, I think, for people to sit in their rooms, their bedrooms at home, and launch out awful comments about people because they just feel somehow that they're protected, they can anonymize themselves. And, you know, it's 24/7. That's the problem with social media, right? At any given moment, at any given time, you could feel offended, and, you know, your knee-jerk reaction could be to send a group text out or airdrop a picture to a group of people in school. I know, Tim, I believe that you've dealt with so many of these issues, sort of like the back end part of what Detective Ingalls was saying in the juvenile system. I know you deal with this all the time. We have a lot of conversations about it. So one of the recommendations, if I could turn to you, Tim, for a second, and that is that the report focuses on prevention, right, instead of punishment. And in fact, that's one of the tenets of the juvenile system, and rehabilitation, et cetera. And, you know, what are your thoughts on that? You know, there are a lot of people who sometimes feel that there's not sufficient punishment under the juvenile system for the crimes that occur, the bias crimes that may be committed by youth.
I think our laws are sufficiently written to allow for appropriate education and punishment in the juvenile justice system in New Jersey. We're a very progressive state, and we're a very progressive prosecutor's office here in Camden County. And yes, prevention and rehabilitation are two of the primary focuses. But we have to remember there's balance to be reached. It's not an easy balance. That balance is not just the rehabilitation of the juvenile who's committed the act. We have to balance that with the rights of the victim and the protection of the community. And obviously, sometimes you're going to have diametrically opposed positions because you're going to have the victim who wants to see a harsher punishment, and you're going to see the person who's committed the act who wants a lesser punishment. And so we have to balance that out to figure out what's the right result, what's fair, just, and equitable. And when we're doing that, we have to balance that. We have to also put into play, we apply compassion and understanding too to the situation, because we don't know what the actor's adverse childhood experiences were, what trauma they've sustained. And again, we have to remember, this is learned behavior when we're talking about biases. So what we're really doing is we kind of look at the big picture here, and we look at, you know, all these life experiences have molded this person, this young person, this youth, to act a certain way. And they've experienced many, what I call influencers, these different things in their life that have brought them to this point. You know, these influencers have shaped their thoughts and opinions. And we as a community, really what we have to do is we have to make sure that the positive influences outweigh the negative influences. And really, and Dr. Johnson hit the nail on the head when he said, you know, education, I know, is always the key, but he said also the relationships and communication. And from that, we have to have outreach in our community. We have to have relationships with our community where our community will step up and address these things with us. So it's the rehabilitation. We really look at it from the therapeutic aspect. We try to get to the why. We've seen the kid has grown up and has developed this bias, and now we need to know why and how can we change that. And so we want to look at the youth's behavior and see, is that a symptom? Is there an underlying situation that we can help correct? I think it's helpful to have an example. And what I mean by that is this. So let's say we have a kid in the community who feels isolated or a lack of support in their community for whatever reason that may be. And they turn to social media and negative influences on social media, or they act out themselves on social media, illegal computer activity, cyber harassment, or something like that. Well, now that we're involved, once Detective Ingalls is involved, our unit is also involved. We have to figure out now, how do we address that? Do we do it by, we have to charge the child? Hopefully not. We want to treat it therapeutically through education and therapy. So what we're going to do is we're going to try to link that kid to services that are going to re-educate them, teach them differently, but also find out what are their interests. If this kid has a real interest in computer activity, then let's link them to a program, something like Hopework, to teach them web design. And let's get their interest onto something else and get them positive role models within their community that can help form a new perspective on things. Because a lot of times it's because that child's been isolated in a certain environment. And we need to, as a community, step out of our own comfort zone, as we are at this conversation here today. But also we need to force that child to step out of their zone. It may not be a comfort zone, but out of their zone, to see if there's more to life than what they're experiencing, and hopefully change for the better.
Right. That's really well said. It sort of dovetails into what I wanted to go into next, which is the third category of the report. And this is where Rosie, you and Riley come into play again. And that is, you know, the public engagement piece and the importance of that, because, you know, I believe as Tim mentioned, you know, school, Dr. Johnson, is just one part of a student's life, but certainly a big part of a student's life because so much time is spent there. But then, you know, even what you're trying to undo or unlearn in school is going to be countered by what could be occurring at home. And, you know, that's a very strong influence for sure. And so I think there are so many youth out there, and going to you, Riley, where you talked about the LGBTQ plus community, where home may not be a safe space. And so community organizations are critical to helping our youth wade through these issues. So Riley, if I could turn to you, in dealing with teens that you may encounter or youth, what do you say to someone who would say, well, I'm not biased. I just don't want to get involved, but I'm not biased, but I don't want to get involved. Is it simple because I don't want to be labeled, I don't want to be that kid? Is it enough to simply not be biased?
So I read this question over pretty thoroughly, and you know, it's not even just youth or teens, it's also adults that they don't want to stir things up, right? Or stand up and advocate for a marginalized population because they don't want to now be included or be perceived as being part of that population, quote unquote, being labeled. And what I say is, so what are you afraid of? What does having that label possibly attached to you mean for you? Because I think teens, for the most part, especially, I mean, I'm 53. Teens back when I was in high school in 1986, teens were very different than what I believe teens are now. You know, most teens in general are supportive of the LGBTQ population. Not saying everybody is, but it's always that deeper dive, like Dr. Johnson was saying. What is the fear? What's the fear of stirring things up? Don't people think it's about time we stirred things up? You know, because there's more and more exposure regarding LGBTQ population and communities. But I think also asking them, is there anybody that you know that is a positive role model that you know is in that community that can help, you know, ease your fears or support you in stirring things up and getting more involved? Because kids are dying. Kids are dying because of, you know, lack of support, because they're getting kicked out of their houses, because they're being abused by family members who are not, you know, accepted. So it's not about stirring things up. It's possibly about saving a life.
Can I just add something to that? I think it's important, what you said about the community engagement. I think we can have this report and we can have laws, and we can have certain policies that are going to be mandated to be implemented, but without having that community support the educators, support law enforcement, support these type organizations, it won't fully run, right? So I know one thing, and I keep hearing is that mentor or that person to help. And I know one thing I do in Camden City, being born and raised there, is that I always try to go back to my old high school and speak whenever I can, and try to encourage people to go on that right path. And I think Dr. Johnson said it best, is that people respond better when they see someone who shares in that same type of background. And I think that if we have people listening now and then us on the panel, if one thing we can take from this is to definitely engage more in our communities, not just as a detective or not just as the educator, but as a person. And like you said, prosecutor, as that Black man or as that trans man, and speak up and start to support our community. I think that it can be one big collaborative effort, to push, to a point where we won't have to have this conversation about bias anymore.
In anticipation of our conversation today, I just received earlier, about an hour before we went live, from Rosie, a survey that was distributed among the students at the Muslim Student Associations. We've been talking a lot about African American, Latina, LGBTQ, but certainly the Muslim population is front and center and part of this conversation, and their experiences. And so they put together this, I guess it was a study that a survey was distributed among the students at the Muslim Student Associations at Rutgers University and Cherry Hill High School East just recently on January 26th. The purpose was to get statistics about the bias incidents experienced by the Muslim youth in New Jersey. And then they took that survey and they listed out some of the conclusions that were drawn. And the first one was approximately 90% of the students surveyed, 90% have faced negative bias due to being Muslim. 90% of the students were never, they experienced a bias incident. And it goes on to detail, despite the terrorist attacks back in 9/11 being so, I guess, far at this point, they occurred in 2001, there's still such an enormous amount of bias against the Muslim community still today. And, certainly I think that goes to the curriculum, going back to the curriculum and teaching, not just about the African American community and their contributions, or teaching the curriculum that includes the Holocaust, but teaching about the different religions and different cultures to I guess, get rid of the stereotypes that people still have today. It's just shocking to me that these are the numbers. And I truly appreciate the Muslim Student Association doing this so quickly and bringing it to our attention. Rosie, I know you were in touch with the Student Association. Have you dealt with a lot of Muslim students in your capacity?
We've had some participate and help plan our countywide Shore Summit, which is Students United for Respect and Equity. Since you still have the slide up for public engagement, that in and of itself, the fact that the Muslim community and Muslim youth community saw that this conversation was going to occur, reached out and said they want to engage, they want to have a conversation, they want to be at the table, and took it upon themselves to put all this information together so that we acknowledge and we address and we find ways to continue to partner, because that's exactly it. That community engagement, all we have to do is listen. We just have to take the time, acknowledge any harm that has been done, try to create solutions around that harm, and be supportive and be allies at all levels. But those build community partnerships. And that, I'm just absolutely impressed by the students and the conversations I've had with students at Eastern, with their Muslim Student Association at Cherry Hill East, and at Rutgers that shared this information. But they have been predominant. They are a large voice in various school districts. And I think just being reminded that we just have to be relevant to what our youth need and be their allies. I think earlier we talked about, you know, the engagement piece and what that means, and, you know, partnering with organizations and, you know, putting all this on schools, like all these recommendations, there's, you know, half of them are towards education, right? There's only so many hours in a day where a school can actually occupy a student's time so that they could be, they could have the nourishment their mind needs to be successful. So incorporating and changing curriculum, yes, that's one part of it, but the rest of the community as a whole has to share in that same vision. Community centers have to be open for our youth. They have to have safe spaces so that they could have a space to relax and enjoy themselves. You know, there's always that conversation around youth not having enough recreational activities. You know, some of our communities who are more urban, you know, the amount of recreational opportunities that they have access to are limited. So, you know, community spaces, think about how we can reallocate dollars in these communities as system stakeholders. You know, we have to hold ourselves accountable to our community. We are public servants and we work for every single person in this community, and we have to represent each and every single person.
I just wanted to touch base too about community centers. So at Center for Family Services, we have what we call family success centers. And we also have a program that's a peer-led LGBTQ support group. So because of COVID, we haven't been able to really, the attendance for Kaleidoscope has dropped. So now we're going to look into utilizing our family success centers so that the teens can have a safe place to go. Because again, it's very, very important, engaging communities and even like local restaurants. If the LGBT community, we scan. So if you see a rainbow flag, you see a trans flag, you see anything that's in a window, on a wall, you know, just having the community put something up to signify that that is a safe place, that you know, a young gay couple could go into that restaurant on their first date and feel safe, and they won't be afraid of being kicked out or looked at or being treated poorly by the wait staff. So
within the past, I would say 4 or 5 years, we've the Youth Services Commission has helped establish and recreate or reconvene conversations to develop stronger partnerships with law enforcement and schools and community and faith-based organizations. These partnerships have led to finding assets in the community that can support youth in their communities. So assets like the person down the street that likes to cook that would love to take the time to spend with a young person to teach them how to cook, or the mechanic that's willing to take the time on a Saturday to show someone how to change the oil. Like those are engagement pieces that offer safe spaces for our youth to be involved in. And those normally are where the youth are able to have really intimate conversations, in the sense that if they're struggling through something, they have someone that they connected with. This entire report is based on all these incidences that have occurred, but there are beautiful partnerships coming to the table that are led by our schools or our faith-based organization or programs in the community, or individuals that, you know, felt that they needed to see change in their community. I go back to all the students organizing last year and the beauty of them asking law enforcement and school districts to come to the table to hear what they have to say so they could feel safe. That in and of itself can start the conversation on removing bias. You know, training and incorporating curriculum, those are just small, like pieces of the puzzle. The rest of it is us as adults in this community have to shift and start looking at that our youth are going to be leading the next, they're going to be our leaders. They are our leaders. So we need to take the time and listen to what they have to say. And these partnerships that have been built, we need to strengthen them and rely on them in our communities.
getting close to our time. This flew by. I can't believe it. I could just keep going. I wanted to click on this last slide as we turn to close, because it's really one of my absolute favorite quotes. It's by Mark Twain. And it says, "Travel is fatal to prejudice, bigotry, and narrow-mindedness, and many of our people need it sorely on these accounts. Broad, wholesome, charitable views of men and things cannot be acquired by vegetating in one little corner of the earth all of one's lifetime." And I love that quote because, the takeaway to me is this, and that is, by getting out of your everyday space, whether that's, as you talked about, Rosie, whether that's your home, your school, your town, your state, your country, and being exposed to differences in dress, in culture, in religion, in that particular society, location of societal norms, whatever it may mean, you quickly realize that the world is such an incredibly diverse place, and you are just one small piece of that world. And the only way to have, or I guess one good way to broaden your horizons or to broaden your view, is to branch out in small ways and big ways. Because I think when you see all the differences in everybody throughout, it sort of helps to normalize difference, that, hatred is so often based on fear and uncomfortableness or lack of exposure. And so I love this quote. I've always loved this quote. I think it's a great idea for people to keep in mind, to keep broadening your horizons. But we have like a minute or two, I guess, to close up. So I just wanted to throw it out. If anybody else, if our high school students wanted to jump in for a final word, since they truly are the most important panelists here, they wanted to jump in and have anything that they wanted to say as a closing comment.
I'll go first. I
Sure.
agree with majority of what everything was said today, and it was honestly a really great opportunity to come here and to listen to everyone speak. I do agree, I agree the most with Mr. Keenan with the LGBTQ and being taught in schools. I feel like it's not talked about, and especially in health classes. I think that's something where it's a necessity to have that. It's not just girl on boy, it's furthermore, and I think that's something that definitely needs to be talked about. But again, thank you for having me, and I'm really glad to be here.
Anna, you have anything you want to jump in on as we close things out?
I just
Yes,
want,
I just want.
I'm
Go
sorry.
ahead.
No, go ahead. I thought you said Riley. My apologies.
No, I just want to thank you for letting me be here today. I do agree with him, Mr. Keenan, a lot. There are a lot of different things that I feel like need to be pushed into our curriculum a lot more. So we're not growing up not knowing anything, especially if our parents are hiding stuff from us and telling us one thing. I think there are a lot of things that need to be pushed a lot more. And again, it's just a lot of things that happen in this world that try and make someone feel out of place, and it shouldn't be like that. And we are all one, we are all human, we all breathe the same way. So again, I just want to thank you for having me today.
Thank you. So I want to put our last slide on there because that really is important to have that contact information. I want to thank every single panelist for taking the time to be on here today, especially, as I said, Ayana and Giovanna. It takes a lot of confidence and a lot of courage, to take part in these difficult discussions. And as I said, your voice is really an important piece to this conversation. I appreciate you accepting my invitation to be part of the panel today. And I hope to continue this conversation. I don't want it to be a one and done. You have my contact information and certainly can contact this office at any time, and I hope to continue with events like this today. So thank you again to our panelists, and thank you for everyone who logged on to watch today. We truly appreciate it. It's just one step that I think we can take at the prosecutor's office to be part of this voice of changing the conversation. And it's certainly important to me, I can tell you that, as the chief law enforcement of the office or officer of the county, and that is, it's important to me for the community to understand that my view is that you know, it's these kinds of sessions and listening sessions are important to me. And I want to continue to have these kinds of conversations. So thank you again so much. I really appreciate it. And I guess that's it. I guess we have to close it out. So thank you, everyone, and be safe and be well.
Thank you so much. You too.
Thank you.
Care.
Take care, everyone.
Thank you. Take care.